After what felt like one of the longest weeks in recent memory, Thomas finally pushed open the door to his small, modest apartment in Sydney. The familiar creak of the old hinges was a comforting sound after the constant hum of the office, where he had spent the better part of his time. Every muscle in his body ached, not just from the physical demands of work, but from the mental exhaustion that had accumulated over the past several days. The week had been filled with meetings, deadlines, and the kind of stress that seemed to seep into every corner of his mind, leaving him feeling drained and disconnected from everything around him. It was one of those weeks where even the simple act of existing felt like a challenge. The apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of the TV that had been left on, casting soft shadows across the walls. Thomas hadn't even remembered turning it on, but it didn't matter. He dropped his bag by the door and made his way to the couch, not bothering to turn on any lights. The familiarity of the worn cushions and the quiet hum of the television in the background provided a sense of comfort that he hadn't realized he'd been craving all day. He collapsed onto the couch without a second thought, his body sinking into the fabric as though it had been waiting for this moment all week. He didn't even bother to change out of his work clothes, his shirt still slightly damp from the heat of the day, clinging to his skin as he sprawled out, too tired to care. The silence of the apartment was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the outside world. It enveloped him like a warm blanket, and before he knew it, his eyelids grew heavy. The soft flicker of the TV was the last thing he remembered before he drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. Time slipped away from him, the kind of sleep that seemed to suspend reality for a little while, letting him escape the weight of his daily life. Hours might have passed, or maybe it was just minutes. It was impossible to tell. But for the first time in days, his mind was quiet, free from the constant buzz of thoughts and worries that usually kept him awake at night. He would have remained in that peaceful state if not for the subtle shift in the air. At first, it was barely noticeable, just the faintest sense of movement beside him. It could have been anything, maybe a change in the temperature or perhaps just the way his body had settled into the couch. But then he felt it again, more distinctly this time. The weight of someone else sitting beside him. It wasn't an unusual occurrence. His nephew, Ryan, often dropped by unannounced, slipping in quietly to hang out or watch TV while Thomas rested. It had become something of a routine for them. Ryan would let himself in with the spare key Thomas had given him, and they would spend time together without needing to say much. Sometimes, they barely even acknowledged each other's presence, content in the shared silence. But tonight felt different. Even in his half-asleep state, Thomas could sense that something had changed. The weight beside him was familiar, but there was an odd tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. His mind was still foggy from sleep, and he didn't fully comprehend what was happening at first. The soft sound of breathing reached his ears, slow, steady, and close, much closer than he expected. He could feel the warmth of another body beside him, not in the casual, distant way Ryan usually sat, but closer, more intimate. The heat radiated off Ryan's body, and though Thomas's mind was still struggling to wake up fully, he couldn't ignore the fact that this didn't feel like their usual routine. His muscles tensed slightly as the realization began to sink in. Something about the way Ryan moved beside him felt intentional, deliberate. Thomas could feel the subtle brush of skin against his own, the sensation sending a shiver down his spine despite the warmth that surrounded them. His pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he was still dreaming. It wouldn't have been the first time his dreams had blended into reality, leaving him disoriented when he finally woke up. But no, this was different. The warmth, the weight, the quiet breaths. They were too real, too present to be part of a dream. For a split second, Thomas considered opening his eyes, pulling himself out of the half-awake state he was in. He wanted to see what was happening, to confirm what his body was already telling him. But something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of breaking the moment, or perhaps it was the uncertainty of what he would find if he opened his eyes. Instead, he stayed still, his breathing slow and steady, pretending to still be asleep. His body was frozen, caught between the desire to understand and the hesitation that came with it. He could feel Ryan shift slightly beside him, his movements slow and measured, as though he didn't want to disturb Thomas's sleep. But every slight touch, every subtle movement was like a spark against Thomas's skin, igniting sensations he hadn't expected. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. But the exhaustion that had consumed him earlier made it difficult to think clearly. All he could do was lie there, feeling the soft brush of Ryan's arm against his own, the warmth of his body close enough to feel but not quite touching. It was an odd, almost surreal experience, and Thomas wasn't sure what to make of it. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last as Thomas lay there, his heart beating a little faster with each passing moment. He could feel Ryan's presence more acutely now. The slow rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, the quiet sound of his breath close to Thomas's ear. It was also familiar, yet so different at the same time. Thomas had always been close to Ryan. Their bond had been strong for as long as he could remember. But this was new, uncharted territory that neither of them had explored before. And yet, despite the unfamiliarity of the moment, there was something oddly comforting about it. The warmth, the quiet intimacy of the space they shared. It was unlike anything Thomas had experienced before. As the weight of Ryan's presence settled beside him, Thomas realized that something had shifted between them, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for longer than he had been willing to admit. As Thomas lay on the couch, teetering on the edge of consciousness, the subtle shift beside him began to pull him from the depths of his sleep. At first, it felt like a distant sensation, a ripple in the stillness of the apartment. His mind, still foggy and disoriented, struggled to comprehend what was happening. The hum of the TV was a familiar comfort, a background noise that he had become accustomed to. But now there was something more. The quiet wasn't just filled with the drone of the television. There was something else, something far more intimate. He felt the weight beside him shift again. And this time, it was unmistakable. Ryan was there, as he often was, sitting next to him on the couch. But this time, it felt different. The closeness of his nephew's body wasn't the casual, comfortable proximity that Thomas was used to. It was something else. The warmth radiating from Ryan's body felt more intense, more deliberate. The space between them seemed almost non-existent, and Thomas couldn't help but notice how much closer Ryan was sitting than usual. His body tensed involuntarily, as though his mind was trying to warn him of something his heart wasn't ready to acknowledge. He lay still, pretending to be asleep. His eyes closed, as if the act of keeping them shut would help him make sense of the unfamiliar sensations running through him. He could hear Ryan's quiet breathing, slow and steady, just inches away from his ear. There was a moment of stillness, as though both of them were caught in the same uncertain space, not quite ready to acknowledge what was happening. Then, almost imperceptibly, Thomas felt the faintest brush of skin, Ryan's arm against his. It was light, almost as if it had happened by accident. But the touch sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. His heart began to race, the steady rhythm growing erratic as his mind scrambled to catch up. What was this? Why was Ryan so close? Why did this feel different? Questions swirled in his head, but no answers came. Instead, his body reacted instinctively, his breath catching in his throat as he felt another touch, this time more deliberate. Ryan's hand lightly grazed Thomas's shoulder, the touch gentle but undeniably intentional. Ryan? Thomas thought to himself, his mind screaming the question he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. He wanted to open his eyes to see the look on Ryan's face, but something held him back. Fear, maybe? Or confusion? He wasn't sure, but whatever it was, it kept him frozen in place, his heart thudding in his chest as he lay still, pretending to sleep. The air between them felt heavy, charged with something unspoken but palpable. Thomas could feel Ryan shift again, his body moving even closer, until there was no more space between them. His hand, which had been resting on Thomas's shoulder, now began to trail down his arm. The touch was light, teasing, and Thomas could feel the heat of Ryan's fingers through the thin fabric of his shirt. It was a touch that felt far too intimate for their usual relationship, far too intentional. Still, Thomas didn't move. He couldn't. His body was caught in the tension of the moment, torn between the urge to confront what was happening and the overwhelming desire to see where it would go. He felt trapped in his own skin, unsure whether he wanted to stop Ryan or let him continue. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, and for the first time in a long while, he felt completely unsure of himself. And then, Ryan's voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant, as if testing the waters. The question hung in the air, quiet but loaded with meaning. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat at the sound of Ryan's voice, so close to his ear that he could feel the warmth of his breath on his neck. He didn't respond right away, hoping that if he stayed silent, Ryan might stop, might give him a way out of this confusing situation. But deep down, Thomas knew that he didn't want a way out. When he didn't answer, Ryan chuckled softly, the sound low and almost mischievous. "Thought so," he murmured, his voice carrying a tone of quiet amusement. "You're terrible at pretending to sleep, you know." Thomas's heart raced even faster, and he couldn't help but feel a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. How long had Ryan known, and why hadn't he stopped? His mind raced with questions, but before he could process them, he felt Ryan's hand slide lower, trailing down his side, his touch light but insistent. The sensation sent another shiver through Thomas's body, and he fought to suppress a gasp. "What are you doing?" Thomas wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, his body betrayed him, leaning ever so slightly into Ryan's touch. He hated how much he craved the contact, how much his body reacted to the closeness. He hated that he couldn't seem to stop himself from wanting more. Ryan seemed to sense the shift, his movements growing bolder. His hand lingered at Thomas's waist, his fingers brushing lightly against the thin fabric of his shirt. Thomas felt his breath hitch in his throat, and for a moment he wondered if Ryan could hear the rapid beating of his heart. "You don't have to pretend, you know," Ryan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you feel it too." And that the words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He felt his stomach twist with a mix of fear and anticipation. How long had Ryan known? Had he always been aware of the tension between them? The unspoken thing that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long? Thomas had tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but now it was staring him in the face. Undeniable. Ryan's hand slipped under the hem of Thomas's shirt, his fingers brushing against the bare skin of his lower back. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of sensation through Thomas's body, and he couldn't help but arch slightly into it. He hated how much he wanted this, how much he had been yearning for this without even realizing it. Finally, unable to keep up the charade any longer, Thomas opened his eyes. He turned his head just enough to see Ryan, their faces inches apart. The look in Ryan's eyes was intense, dark, filled with something that Thomas had never seen before, something that made his heart race even faster. "Ryan," Thomas whispered, his voice shaky and uncertain. It was the first word he had spoken, and even as it left his lips, he wasn't sure what he was going to say next. But Ryan didn't give him a chance to finish. He leaned in, his lips brushing lightly against Thomas's neck, sending another wave of heat through his body. "Eesh," Ryan murmured, his breath warm against Thomas's skin. "You don't have to say anything." Thomas's mind was a whirlwind, spinning with confusion, desire, and fear all at once. He wanted to push Ryan away, to tell him to stop, but he couldn't. The tension between them had been building for so long, and now, with Ryan's touch setting his skin on fire, it was impossible to deny. "I don't know if we should—" Thomas started, his voice barely audible, but the words felt weak even as he spoke them. Ryan pulled back slightly, his eyes meeting Thomas's. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked, his voice quiet but serious. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't want Ryan to stop. He couldn't deny that now. Not with the way his body was reacting to every touch, every breath, every look, and Ryan could see it. He could see the conflict in Thomas's eyes, the way his body betrayed his hesitation. Ryan smiled then, a small, knowing smile. "I didn't think so," he said softly, his hand gently squeezing Thomas's side. "Just let it happen. You don't have to fight it anymore." Thomas felt his resolve crumbling. The wall he had built up between them was falling apart, piece by piece, and he was powerless to stop it. As Thomas lay there, the weight of Ryan's presence pressed against him. He couldn't deny the tension that had been building between them for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just tonight. It had been there for months, maybe even longer, unspoken, unacknowledged, but always simmering beneath the surface. The moments when their hands brushed just a little too long. The lingering glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. The way Ryan's voice would drop just slightly when they were alone. All of it added up to something neither of them had been brave enough to confront. Now, with Ryan so close, his breath warm on the back of Thomas's neck, the tension felt suffocating. Thomas could feel Ryan's hand resting lightly at his waist, fingers barely grazing his skin but sending shockwaves through him all the same. He wanted to move, to pull away, but his body wouldn't respond. Instead, he found himself frozen, caught between the undeniable desire pulling him toward Ryan and the fear of what it would mean if he gave in. Ryan's fingers flexed slightly against his waist, the touch deliberate yet soft. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Thomas could feel his pulse racing, his heartbeat so loud in his ears that he was sure Ryan could hear it too. Ryan's voice was a low murmur, cutting through the quiet like a knife. It was the first word spoken in what felt like hours, though it had probably only been a few minutes. Thomas's stomach flipped at the sound of his name on Ryan's lips, the familiarity of it mixed with something deeper, something unspoken that had always lingered between them. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Yeah." His voice came out rougher than he intended, barely above a whisper. Ryan didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, his hand moved slightly, his fingers tracing lazy circles against Thomas's side, just under the hem of his shirt. The touch was light, teasing, and Thomas had to bite his lip to keep from gasping. "You feel it too, don't you?" Ryan's voice was soft, but sure, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Thomas's heart raced. There it was. The question he had been avoiding. The thing neither of them had ever said out loud. He felt his breath catch in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. How could he? How could he admit that, yes, he had felt it too, all along? That every moment they spent together had been tinged with something more, something he had been too scared to acknowledge. He closed his eyes, trying to gather his thoughts. But the sensation of Ryan's hand on his skin made it impossible to think clearly. His mind was a blur, and all he could focus on was the heat of Ryan's touch and the way his body seemed to lean into it without his permission. Thomas started, but the words died in his throat. What was he supposed to say? That yes, he felt it too. That he had been trying to deny it for months. That he wasn't sure what to do now that it was out in the open. Ryan's hand stilled against his side, and Thomas could feel the shift in the air between them. Ryan was waiting for him to say something. Anything. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but it was no longer just unspoken. It was real, tangible, hanging between them like a thread waiting to snap. I don't know, Thomas finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't the answer Ryan was looking for, but it was the only one he could give. Ryan sighed softly, his breath warm against Thomas's neck. You don't have to know, he said, his voice gentle, almost reassuring. I just need to know if you want this. Thomas's chest tightened at the question. Want. That was the crux of it, wasn't it? Did he want this? The truth was he had wanted it for a long time, but he had always been too scared to admit it, even to himself. He had told himself that the closeness between them was normal, that the way his heart raced when Ryan was near was just a product of their deep bond. But now, with Ryan's hand on his skin and his voice low in his ear, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. Did he want this? Yes, he did. But wanting it and acting on it were two very different things. What would it mean for them if they crossed this line? What would it change between them? And Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't know what happens if we do this. Ryan's fingers tightened slightly against his side, but his voice remained calm. We don't have to figure that out right now, he said softly. We can just be here in this moment. Together, Thomas's breath caught at the simplicity of Ryan's words. Just be here. It sounded so easy, so uncomplicated. But could it really be that simple? Could they just exist in this moment without worrying about what came next? He didn't know. But what he did know was that the tension between them wasn't going away. It was there, pulsing between them, demanding to be acknowledged. And for the first time, Thomas wasn't sure he wanted to keep fighting it. Slowly, carefully, he turned in Ryan's arms, their faces inches apart now. Ryan's eyes searched his, filled with a mixture of anticipation and something deeper. Something that had always been there but had never been spoken out loud. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat at the intensity of Ryan's gaze. I don't know where this is going, Thomas said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. But I think I want to find out. Ryan's lips curled into a small, soft smile, and he nodded, his hand moving to cup the side of Thomas's face. That's all I needed to hear, he murmured. And then before Thomas could say another word, Ryan leaned in, his lips brushing lightly against Thomas's in the softest, most tentative of kisses. It was slow, almost hesitant, as if Ryan was waiting for Thomas to stop him. But Thomas didn't stop him. He couldn't. The warmth of Ryan's lips against his was everything he had been denying for so long. And now that it was happening, he couldn't bring himself to pull away. The unspoken tension that had hung between them for so long finally snapped, giving way to something neither of them could deny anymore. As they lay there, bodies close, the weight of the moment began to sink in for both of them. The tension that had been simmering for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that neither of them fully understood yet. Thomas could feel the rise and fall of Ryan's chest against his own, their breaths synchronizing in the silence of the room. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. Yet every touch, every heartbeat reminded Thomas that this was very real. He shifted slightly, his head resting on the pillow as his eyes met Ryan's. The look in Ryan's eyes was unreadable, a mix of emotions swirling just beneath the surface. Desire, relief, and something deeper, something that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. They had crossed a line, one they could never uncross. But in that moment, it didn't feel wrong. It felt like something that had been inevitable, a truth they had both been avoiding for far too long. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was as if they were both trying to process what had just happened, what it meant for them. Thomas felt the urge to say something, anything, but words seemed inadequate in the face of what they had just shared. Ryan broke the silence first, his voice quiet but firm. I've wanted this for a long time, he admitted, his eyes searching Thomas's for a reaction. Thomas's breath caught in his throat at the confession. He had known deep down that there was something between them, something unspoken but always there. But hearing Ryan say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. It wasn't just a fleeting moment or a passing feeling. This was something that had been building, something they had both been too afraid to acknowledge. How long, Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure why he needed to know, but the question slipped out before he could stop it. Ryan's lips curled into a small, almost sheepish smile. Longer than I'd like to admit, he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. I didn't know if you felt the same, though. I didn't want to ruin anything. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The honesty in Ryan's words hit him harder than he expected. He had been so focused on denying his own feelings, on convincing himself that what he felt was wrong, that he hadn't even considered that Ryan might have been going through the same thing. I didn't know what to do with it, Thomas admitted, his voice soft. I kept telling myself it wasn't there, that I was imagining things. He hesitated for a moment, then added, but I wasn't, was I? Ryan shook his head, his fingers brushing lightly against Thomas's arm. No, you weren't. It's been there for a while, I think. Thomas nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. It was as if the weight of all the unspoken words, the hidden feelings, had finally been lifted. They weren't pretending anymore. They weren't hiding from the truth. For a moment, they just lay there. The silence between them comfortable now, filled with the quiet understanding of what they had both been too afraid to admit. Thomas could feel the warmth of Ryan's hand resting on his side, his touch gentle but grounding. It felt like an anchor, something to hold on to as they navigated this new reality. What happens now? Thomas asked quietly, not entirely sure he wanted an answer, but feeling the need to ask the question all the same. Ryan's eyes met his, a flicker of uncertainty passing through them. I don't know, he admitted, his voice honest. I didn't think this far ahead. Thomas smiled at that, the tension in his chest easing just a little. Me neither, he said, his tone lighter now, the weight of the moment not as heavy as it had been just a few minutes ago. They shared a small laugh, the sound breaking through the quiet, and for a brief moment, everything felt almost normal again. But underneath the laughter, there was still that lingering question of what came next. Neither of them had the answer, but for now, that was okay. They didn't need to figure it all out at once. Ryan's hand moved up to cup the side of Thomas's face, his thumb brushing lightly against his cheek. We'll figure it out, he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. Whatever this is, whatever we want it to be, we'll figure it out. Thomas felt his heart swell at Ryan's words. There was no rush, no pressure to define what they were or where this was going. They had time, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt like that was enough. He didn't need to have all the answers right now. All that mattered was that they were here, together, finally acknowledging what had been between them all along. Yeah, Thomas said, his voice soft but sure, we'll figure it out. Ryan smiled at that, his eyes softening as he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to Thomas's forehead. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a depth of emotion that didn't need to be spoken. They didn't need to say anything more. The shared confession between them, the quiet admission of their feelings, was enough for now. And as they lay there, wrapped up in each other, Thomas realized that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where they were meant to be. The air in the room felt heavier than before, as if everything between them had finally been brought into sharp focus. Thomas lay still, his mind racing, heart pounding in his chest. It was as if the quiet intimacy they had shared just moments ago had flipped a switch, bringing them face to face with a reality they had both been avoiding. The truth was no longer a distant concept. It was here, inescapable, staring them both down. Ryan was close, his body pressed lightly against Thomas's. His touch, once tentative and soft, now felt steady, as though he was no longer afraid of what it meant. Thomas could feel the warmth of Ryan's breath against his skin, the gentle rise and fall of his chest. Yet, despite the closeness, there was a new tension between them, an anticipation that neither could ignore. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. The silence was thick, filled with everything that had been left unsaid. It wasn't just about what had happened a few minutes ago. It was about what had been happening between them for months, the unspoken feelings, the lingering looks, the fleeting touches that had meant so much more than either of them had dared to admit. It all came rushing to the surface now, and there was no turning back. Finally, Thomas broke the silence, his voice quiet and unsure. What are we doing, Ryan? Ryan's eyes searched his, the usual playful glint now replaced with something more serious, more intense. He didn't answer right away, as if he was weighing his words carefully, trying to find the right way to express everything he was feeling. Thomas could see the conflict in his eyes, the way Ryan was trying to navigate this new, uncertain territory. I don't know, Ryan admitted, his voice low but steady. But I know I don't want to stop. His words hung in the air, heavy and real. Thomas felt his chest tighten at the honesty in Ryan's voice. There it was, the truth they had been avoiding for so long. Ryan didn't want to stop, and the truth was, neither did Thomas. But the weight of what that meant, of what this could change between them, was still there, looming over them like a shadow. Thomas swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. But what does this mean for us? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens if we don't stop? Ryan's hand, which had been resting gently on Thomas's side, moved up to cup his face, his thumb brushing lightly against Thomas's cheek. The touch was comforting, grounding, and for a moment, it helped calm the storm of thoughts swirling in Thomas's mind. We don't have to figure all of that out right now, Ryan said softly, his eyes never leaving Thomas's. I want to be honest with you. I felt this for a long time, and I know you have too. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the weight of Ryan's words wash over him. He had felt it for so long, but he had always pushed it aside, told himself it was just his imagination. But now, hearing Ryan say it out loud, it felt like a floodgate had opened, releasing everything Thomas had been trying to hold back. Yeah, Thomas whispered, his voice shaky but honest. Ryan's lips curved into a small, relieved smile, and Thomas felt his heart skip a beat at the sight of it. There was something incredibly comforting about knowing they were on the same page, that this wasn't just some fleeting moment of confusion. It was real, and it had been real for a long time. Ryan's hand remained on Thomas's face, his thumb gently tracing the curve of his cheekbone. I don't know what happens next, Ryan admitted, his voice soft but sincere. But I want to find out. Thomas opened his eyes, meeting Ryan's gaze. There was no hesitation in Ryan's expression, no doubt. It was the kind of clarity Thomas hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. And for the first time, he felt the tension in his chest ease. Just a little. Okay, Thomas said quietly, his voice steadying as the words left his lips. Let's figure it out together. Ryan's smile widened, his eyes softening with a mix of relief and something deeper, something Thomas had always known was there, but had been too scared to acknowledge. It felt like a moment of truth, not just for what was happening between them, but for everything that had led them to this point. All the silent confessions, the unspoken words, the things they had been too afraid to say were finally out in the open. Ryan leaned in, his forehead resting gently against Thomas's, and for a moment, they just stayed like that, breathing in sync, their bodies close but not pressing for more. It wasn't about rushing into anything. It was about being in this moment together, finally honest with each other. You and me, Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with certainty. We'll figure it out. Thomas closed his eyes again, a small smile tugging at his lips. He felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. Yeah, he whispered back. We will. And with that, the air between them shifted once more. Not with tension this time, but with a quiet sense of understanding. They didn't have all the answers, but they didn't need them right now. All that mattered was that they were here, together, finally acknowledging what had been between them all along. As they lay there, close but not tangled in the same urgency as before, Thomas realized that the fear he had been carrying for so long had started to fade. It wasn't gone entirely, but it was no longer overwhelming. Instead, there was a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something they could both hold on to. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt like everything might actually be okay. The night stretched on, the world outside their small cocoon forgotten as the hours slipped by. Thomas and Ryan lay close, their bodies intertwined on the bed. There was a quietness between them now, but it wasn't the silence of uncertainty or tension. It was a comfortable stillness, one that came from finally acknowledging what had been between them for so long. Thomas could still feel the lingering warmth of Ryan's touch on his skin, the memory of their kisses still fresh in his mind. His body was tired, but his mind was wide awake, running through everything that had led them to this moment. For so long, he had fought against the pull he felt toward Ryan, convinced that crossing the line would only lead to confusion and regret. But now, lying here with Ryan beside him, none of that fear mattered anymore. Ryan shifted slightly, his arm draped across Thomas's chest, his fingers lightly tracing patterns against his skin. The touch was soft, almost absent-minded, but it sent a wave of warmth through Thomas's body. He couldn't help but smile at the simplicity of the moment, the way it felt so natural, so right, even after everything that had changed between them tonight. You're quiet, Ryan murmured, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. His head was resting on Thomas's shoulder, and Thomas could feel the slight rumble of his voice against his skin. Thomas glanced down, meeting Ryan's gaze. There was a softness in Ryan's eyes, a mixture of tenderness and something deeper that made Thomas's chest tighten. He couldn't help but smile at the way Ryan was looking at him, like he was seeing him in a new light, even though they had known each other for years. Just thinking, Thomas said softly, his fingers idly playing with a strand of Ryan's hair. About Ryan chuckled quietly, shifting a little closer. Yeah, it's been a lot, he admitted, his hand resting flat against Thomas's chest now. But it feels right, doesn't it? Like this was supposed to happen. Thomas nodded, the words settling over him like a warm blanket. It does, he agreed, his voice low. I don't know why we waited so long. Ryan smiled, a small, content smile that made Thomas's heart flutter. Maybe we weren't ready, Ryan said, his voice thoughtful. But now I think we are. Thomas couldn't argue with that. It felt like everything had fallen into place in a way he hadn't expected. The fear and confusion that had held him back for so long were gone, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. Ryan's hand slid up to cup Thomas's cheek, his thumb brushing lightly across his skin. I'm glad we're here, Ryan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed for a moment. Me too, he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. It was hard to put into words what he was feeling. How relieved he was to finally be here, to finally let himself feel everything he had been holding back, but he didn't need to say it. Ryan already knew. For a while, they stayed like that, wrapped up in each other, the quiet hum of the night their only backdrop. It wasn't about needing to fill the silence with words. It was enough just to be close, to feel the steady rhythm of Ryan's heartbeat against him, to know that they were in this together now. At some point, Ryan shifted again, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look down at Thomas. His fingers traced along Thomas's jawline, the touch soft and intimate. Do you think? Ryan asked, his voice hesitant for the first time that night. Thomas met his gaze, his brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? Ryan's hand stilled against Thomas's cheek. I mean us, he said softly. We've always been close, but it's different now. Do you think it'll change things? Thomas thought about that for a moment. It was a valid question, one that had been at the back of his mind ever since they had crossed the line. But as he looked up at Ryan, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, Thomas realized that it wasn't something he was afraid of anymore. Yeah, Thomas said quietly, his hand resting on top of Ryan's. It will change things. But I don't think that's a bad thing. Ryan's expression softened, relief washing over his features. I don't think so either, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to lose what we have. You won't, Thomas said firmly, his hand squeezing Ryan's gently. Whatever this is between us, it doesn't take away from what we already had. It just adds to it. Ryan's smile returned, brighter this time. I like that, he murmured, leaning down to press a soft kiss to Thomas's lips. The kiss was slow, unhurried, a gentle reminder of everything they had shared tonight. It wasn't about passion or urgency anymore. It was about connection, about being here together in a way they hadn't allowed themselves to be before. When Ryan pulled back, he rested his forehead against Thomas's, their breaths mingling in the quiet. I'm glad we didn't wait any longer, Ryan whispered. Me too, Thomas whispered back, his voice filled with sincerity. They stayed like that for a long time, the night stretching on around them as they held each other close. There were still questions left unanswered, still things they would need to figure out. But for now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that they were here, together, and that was enough. As the first hints of dawn began to creep through the window, casting a soft glow over the room, Thomas felt a sense of contentment settle over him. It wasn't perfect, it was complicated, and messy, and still so new, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. With Ryan's head resting against his chest and their fingers intertwined, Thomas realized that this night had been the beginning of something new, something they would both hold on to for as long as they could. The future was uncertain, but as long as they were together, Thomas knew they could face whatever came next.